Hey guys, this is Mr. V. I'm doing a book review today for Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. What you guys should know before I start the review is that I try to do a spoiler-free book review, so if you occasionally see me looking down, I just have some notes so I don't give away any spoilers. So I'll be reviewing again. It's Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. Now, Hearts in Atlantis is an interesting book because it is considered two novellas and three short stories put into one book, and all the books somewhat connect, very loosely connect. And what I mean by very loosely connect is that they may have some characters from a different story go into the next story, things like that. But each story has a different main character and they have their own completely different story. You will just sometimes see a name and be like, oh yeah, that was a person from a different book, from a different story in Hearts in Atlantis. And that's why they kind of all connect in a way in that fashion. And while it is considered two novellas and three short stories, I consider this one novel, one novella, and three short stories. Because a novella, which they consider a novella, The Low Men in Yellow Coats, is about 300 pages or a little bit more, to where I consider that a novel at that point. It's not a novella. And even the novella Hearts in Atlantis is fairly long as well. But that's what it's considered. Again, two novellas, three short stories. So one thing you guys should know about this story, which is interesting, is all these stories are kind of like growing up stories. And what I mean by that is it shows how people act at different stages in their life. You know, because one of the stories, it takes place when they're a kid. Another story takes place when someone's in college. Another story takes place when someone is in like their 30s and 40s. Another takes place when someone's in their 50s. To where it kind of shows like how people act at different stages. And that's why I said it's like a coming of age or a growing up type of story, because you know your relationships change, how you spend your time changes, your priorities change. So it's very interesting in those regards. And each different segment of it, because there's technically five segments in this book, you know, again, two novellas, three short stories, so there's five different parts to the book. Just has like a different part, a different age, a different thing like that. So this, you know, that is a really cool theme because it shows how different people are, or how people act at different times. And I'll get more in depth in that in just a bit. So another thing, one thing you guys should know right from the beginning is that basically, with the exception of the first novella, the novella, Low Men in Yellow Coats, every story basically just follows one person. There are other characters, but it basically just follows that one person's life. And you know, I'm not saying that person's life ends or anything like that, but it just follows that person's life. Whereas some of the other stories, you know, they kind of build a whole scene. You can say that many books just follow a person's life, but they build a, I don't know, I don't want to say universe, but they kind of build their own world, and there's many things that can happen. Where this one, it just follows that person's life and their interactions, and there are other characters, but it's like it's just following that one person's life. It doesn't, you don't really know what the others are thinking. You can kind of guess, but you know, things like that. So you guys should know that. And another thing about Hearts in Atlantis is that basically all the stories are very sad stories, you know, and I'm not saying that's bad. You know, there's many stories I've read, fictional stories I've read, that are sad stories. And you know, there's been some great ones out there, but you should know that they're all sad stories. It's not going to be this action-packed thing, because sometimes people know Stephen King is more scary or more action-packed. These are all sad stories. So be prepared for that if you're thinking about this book. And another part you should also know is that basically all the stories are pretty slow moving. The novellas are very slow moving, especially given the length. And even the short stories are still fairly long. The short stories, I should say, the short stories are not like 10 pages. The short stories are still like 80 pages or more. So it's not like they're very short, but they move faster just because they're shorter. But even then, they're pretty slow moving. And you'll hear more about that in just a sec when I get into the positives and the negatives for this book. So, oh, lastly, let's make sure you don't forget, before going into this book, make sure that you know your history. And what I mean by know history is you need to know the 1960s. One of the stories takes place in 1960, another takes place in 66, another takes place in 83, and then 1999 and the year 2000. you want to know your history from the 60s because, I'm in my 30s, but, I know the 60s very well because I watched many documentaries on it. My dad grew up in the 60s. We talk about it. But most people may not know, or a decent amount of people may not know that. And you need to know about how the hair was different, how the music changed so much that what we consider pretty soft or classic rock now was very revolutionary and kind of daring at the time. You need to know Vietnam, as that is a central part of many of the stories in there. So make sure you know Vietnam, but you need to know about how much protest there was to Vietnam. Don't just read like one article about Vietnam and the protest. You need to know how much of resistance there was, because I know I watched a great documentary on it and I know a lot about Vietnam and the resistance. So you need to know that. And again, you need to know Vietnam. I'm not saying you need to go and read a thick book on it or anything like that, but you need to know a decent amount about Vietnam, because like there are stories where they would say something like, oh, I wish the Viet Cong had killed that person. And it's like, if you don't know who that is from Vietnam, then it's not that you won't enjoy the story, but you may be a little lost. So those are some things that I would know before getting into this story. And I would say that, that's one thing that I actually didn't like about the stories, or the Hearts in Atlantis as a whole, the whole book, was that a lot of times when I go into these fictional books, as anyone, a lot of times you don't want to have to know too much about the history. That, you don't want to have to know how much was going on in the 60s with the women's rights movements, the Civil Rights Act, the hair changing so much, the music changing so much, Vietnam, their protests. You don't want to have to know all that. It's not bad, but a lot of fictional books, they don't have you do that. And even a lot of Stephen King books don't have you do that. But this one, you definitely should. And, that's where I would say you can kind of put a knock against it, because even though many people will know it, it's not something that you should kind of require your readers to know before going into the book, because you may get a reader that doesn't know some of those, and then all of a sudden they're having to look something up, or they're not enjoying it because of that aspect. So that's one thing I would say that was not good about the book as a whole because of that. But one good thing, he did portray the different stages of life very well. As I said, he portrays like how it was being a kid, your priorities, the stuff that like when you like in the book, someone wants a bike and that you just like, that is your life, just trying to get that bike. But when you get older, it's very different. It's like, yeah, you may want something, but there's a lot of other responsibilities as well. And they show that. And he shows it in different books through that. Or like how you act when you're in college, how like in college, you think you have endless time. You think that, oh, I can study for this test in an hour and be fine. But right now I'll just mess around and play a game. You think that kind of stuff. And then even when you're like back to when you're in your 50s, I'm not in my 50s, but even though I'm in my 30s right now, I look back upon like my childhood and be like, oh, how did I do that? Or why did I do that? And, you think about those types of things. So, he portrays it very well at different stages. And, I think that was a lot of fun because it makes you think back to some of it. And I think he portrays it well. The big knock against it, though, is that most of the stories are boring. I mean, most of them are, the majority of the story is boring. It's just an opinion of mine. I know people feel very differently, because some people love this book, but I felt so many of the stories were boring. That it's like, especially like, I recorded a review for Low Men in Yellow Coats, which you guys can go check out. And I gave that a slightly above average book rating just because I was reading The Dark Tower. I think that's the only reason. But for the most part, I even said that one was a little too long. But some of these other stories, like the main story, Hearts in Atlantis, the main novella, was boring to me. The majority of it, yeah, it does have fun aspects. It's not all boring. But it's like the majority of it is boring. And when you have a 200-page novella, and you have like 150 pages of like just boring stuff, and it's almost just like day-to-day tasks, and you're wondering like, okay, when is something gonna happen? You just start to get bored. And the sad thing was, for many of these, and it's the same with the short stories, some of the short stories that were like 80 pages, I'm just like, okay, I understand what you're saying. Move on already. Like, that happened specifically in one short story. I'm not going to say which one, but there's You know, one, actually two, where I was just like, okay, move on already. You've already shown it. Like, you've already said your point. To where that's why I felt that some of these were so boring. And, you know, and it's like, again, the whole book, Hearts in Atlantis, is 650 pages. So it's like the majority of the book is actually fairly boring. And it's sad because each story I felt had a good end. I'm trying to think of all the endings right now, but I actually enjoyed all the endings of each story. You know, there's one I felt could have ended slightly differently, but I thought it had a good end. And I actually think the last novella or the last short story wraps up everything in Hearts in Atlantis very well. And it was like, it was so heartfelt, and it was just so, it was so well done. And that's the sad part, was that most of the stories were boring. That the premise was interesting, and then it would just be boredom. So, you know, that was the sad part for me. And, you know, that was a big knock against it. And it was sad because I actually thought the ends were really nice, you know, overall. So, you know, but again, that's just a big knock, because a great end does not make up for the amount of boredom, because there were so many areas where he just dragged it out way too much. So, anyway, I am going to rate this on a scale of 0 to 10. My rating system is 0 is absolutely horrible, a book you should not want to read. A 5 is average, and a 10 is phenomenal. Like, that should be your next book. Very few reach it to the 0 category, just as very few reach it to the 10 category, because a 5 is average. With that being said, Hearts in Atlantis as a whole, I would rank a 2. I would rank it a 2. Don't forget, a 5 is average, so a rating of 2 is very low in my standards. It is very, very low, because I think this is the lowest rating I have ever given a Stephen King book. And I said, it hurts for me to say that, because I felt that many of the stories had nice endings, and the last story had such a great ending that wrapped everything up, like kind of linked it all nicely. But that does not make up for how much of the full book was just boring. You know, Low Man and Yellow Coach was decent, but there were parts that they stretched it out too much. But then it's like the main parts of Hearts in Atlantis, like that was so boring to me. Blind Willie was, most of it was fairly boring. You know, Why We're in Vietnam, you know, most of that was like so boring. And it's just like, that's why, and it's 650 pages, and that's why I rate it. And it hurts to say, I rated a 2. But, you know, it's, you know, it'd be up to you guys if you guys want to go read it. You know, you guys may have a different opinion. It's because there's many people online that really like this book, and they really love it. As I said, it was still very heartfelt. There were still some moments of greatness, but overall, with a 5 being average, I rate this a 2, just because of the boredom aspect. If you guys disagree, because I know there will be many people who disagree, please comment below. I hope you guys click the subscribe button. Thank you for watching my book review. This is Mr. V. I hope you guys go and enjoy your reading.